Welcome back to Revolution in Ideology. I am Jared,
I'm Nick.
and we are joined again today by Stefan Huddleston, who recently published an article called When Worlds Collaborate, the Style of Early Tabletop Role-Playing Games, back on December 18th. The reason we brought Stefan back to talk about this article is it's a topic that neither Nick or myself is fully equipped to engage, but we think it's actually a very important topic as we dabble a little bit in pop culture over these last, I don't know, probably year and a half, 2 years, regarding representation in this case tabletop gaming, but for Nick and myself, how this might trickle into what we experience now, 20, 30, 40 years later, regarding representation in all types of gaming and honestly all types of entertainment, and what this says about our society. So I think without further elaboration on my part, I want to introduce Stefan and have him lay the groundwork here for his recent research.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Jared and Nick. What I'm talking about in this article, I'm focusing on tabletop role-playing games, and the most popular of those is Dungeons and Dragons. That's the one people are going to most likely recognize. But there are tabletop role-playing games in all genres. So there are tabletop role-playing games based on movies, on popular TV shows. There are horror games. There are sci-fi games. Pretty much, if you can imagine it, there's probably a tabletop role-playing game out there kind of that fits that particular genre or style. Many of them out there, and they are popular globally. There are games that come from Europe and Asia, all over the world. And this pastime has grown in popularity. It was kind of one of those kind of niche, nerdy pastimes when it originated with Dungeons and Dragons. Was the first game in 1974. But it's grown. It's still niche in comparison to a lot of other things, but it's grown in popularity throughout these years. And so I have played these games all my life, pretty much since 1977. I started playing these games, and I started with Dungeons and Dragons and moved into other games. And so when I was going through the master's program and doing my graduate work, I kind of wanted to go back and kind of compare my experiences with kind of what I had seen and experienced in the 70s and 80s, in the early days of these games, and kind of attack it from an academic perspective and see how that matched up with what I had experienced. Obviously, as has been discussed many times before, and obviously for those who know, I'm black, right? And so my experience was very different because the overwhelming majority of people who play these games are white men. And so that's the overwhelming majority of who plays these games, who wrote these games, particularly in the early years. The diversity has grown with these games recently in the last, say, 20, 25 years or so. But I wanted to go back and kind of research that and kind of try and get at the root of it. And so I was looking. Yeah.
Before you go too much further, I do want your thoughts. What drew you to this academic question? I get what drew you to the question in general. It's an interest of yours and maybe even a passion that you probably have amazing memories about, and you love playing these games. But from the academic angle, what made you want to go back and, like, I guess I'm just asking,
Yeah.
why do you think this matters?
So I think it matters for a few reasons. One, kind of the base themes that are in these games kind of run throughout kind of human experience, right? Lord of the Rings, for instance, is something that people will know, wildly popular. The MCU movies, wildly popular with millions of people around the world. And these games are, in ways, D&D heavily takes from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings in its origins, as well as some other sources. But they deal with themes of things that are very appealing to people, and recurring themes that we see in storytelling
Mm.
throughout human history, right? And so what these games do is they allow people as a player to kind of become a part of that process. So when you have someone, say for instance, who writes a book, somebody writes like a Lord of the Rings, or somebody makes a movie, we are uh, Stuart Hall, who I'll go back to, the great kind of sociologist, Stuart Hall, who coincidentally uh, was originally wanted to be a medieval historian. He was going to go to be a medieval historian, and the reason he did not become a medieval historian was that he was rejected by none other than J.R.R. Tolkien to get into the graduate program that he wanted to get into, where Tolkien was the chair at Oxford, and Tolkien rejected him. So he went into sociology, and he writes this kind of important bit of work, reception theory, and he talks about the way someone who writes like a book or a film or a show, they encode that with certain ideas, right? And then we, as the people who are reading it, we decode it. And what I argue in my thesis and in my article, that the thesis that was drawn from my thesis, is that what role playing games allow us to do is they allow us to re-encode. We are taking information because as a player, um, for those who don't know role playing games are very much similar. One of the closest things I can liken them to is kind of like improv theater, right?
Mm.
You have a person who's called the game master, or in D&D the dungeon master. There are various other names depending on the game, but this is the person who kind of moderates things, kind of regulates the rules, and they lay out the story. So they may describe a particular scene to the players, right? They may say, okay, you find yourself in such and such a place. Here's what it looks like. Here's kind of what the environment is, and maybe they'll give you some hooks for adventure, right? They say, well, you see two shady people in the corner whispering, right? You see some guy follow a person who maybe was waving around a bunch of money out into the street, and they're following them very surreptitiously, like kind of maybe implying that that person is about to be robbed, right? And then they turn it over to the players. What are you guys going to do, right? And you, as the player, have the opportunity then, along with your group mates, to decide what you're going to do, right? You're like, oh, I want to follow that person who just followed the position, or I want to go maybe see if I can sit closer to these guys having this shady conversation. Maybe I can hear what they're up to, right? Um, and so it allows you to kind of be a part of crafting this story, right? And I argue in my article that very early on, what was happening when these games originated in the 1970s, we were coming out of the 1960s. And these games were largely being written by, again, straight white men from middle America, who did not have a lot of necessarily direct contact with what was going on with the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and then also we had Vietnam going on, right, at this time frame. And I argue that all of these things kind of combined, um, influenced the worlds that they were creating, right? They were creating worlds based on the works of Tolkien. They were creating fantasy worlds, sci-fi worlds. But what was really important here was that these were worlds where they could control, right? They knew, at least if not on a conscious level, on a subconscious level, that the world was changing around them in drastic ways, right? Segregation was coming to an end. The ERA was on the table. Uh, um, Abortion was now becoming legal. And Vietnam was happening, right? And they couldn't control their changing world. But these games gave them a place that they could control, a place where they could set the tone of things, and a place where they could save the world, right? They couldn't go to Vietnam and save the world, right? And some of them are Vietnam veterans, or they knew Vietnam veterans who were involved in this. Um, they couldn't save the world, but they could in these worlds that they were creating, right? And these worlds are very heavily based on, like I said, the works of that were come before them, a lot of fantasy works and things like that, sci-fi works. And I further argue that these worlds are almost exclusively in the early days, almost exclusively Eurocentric,
So,
because
so
that's
this, sorry,
yeah.
I didn't mean. So
No,
this
go
is
ahead.
part of the import. If you are going to be creating heroes and villains and narratives and building a world, we're filtering this through a very narrow lens. But that narrow lens is going to then, as we used in a prior episode with you, diffuse to other parts of culture as well. It's going to make it very popular that this very narrow lens, this very Eurocentric lens of what a hero looks like and when cool times in history were and value systems and things along those are all
Hmm.
very specific.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, and so what happens is that we see throughout kind of the history of fantasy in the early and mid 20th century, and that filters into these games as well. What we see is a very heavy focus on kind of a Eurocentric style. So at one point, I use maps from these various games, and I also use maps from like other works, like the works of J.R.R. Tolkien with Lord of the Rings, the works of Robert E. Howard with Conan, and other things like that. And what's happening is what we see based in these maps is we see that we have a fictional version of Europe at the center of these games, right? Now, this happens for a couple of different reasons. And what we see is this Eurocentric styling of kind of a Central Europe. To the south, what we're going to find is an analog of Africa. To the east, we're going to find analogs of Mongolia, China, Japan, the rest of Asia, and things like that, right? And these things all kind of come together in these ways to form kind of a very kind of, again, Eurocentric, but also Orientalist framing of these
Mm.
fictional worlds. Now, now, part of this is intentional on the part of these writers because it's easy. If I show you a map of Robert E. Howard's the world where he's writing, the age, the world of Conan, Hyboria, the central part that's kind of European facing. If you go up to the north, there are a couple of places on this map, Asgard and Vanheim, right? Um, and if I say those names to you and I point to those places and I just say Vikings,
Yeah.
it's a simple, easy shorthand. I don't have to have a lot of exposition explaining to you what these places look like. You already have imaginings of what the people look like. You already have imaginings of what the landscape looks like. If I go south to Stygia and I say ancient Egypt, I say there are snake cults and there are pyramids and things like that. You have these kind of imaginings of kind of this kind of popular imagining of what this place looks like, what it feels like, right? So it makes it very easy on the writer. And one of the reasons that Robert E. Howard did this was that he was able to write in these places without any fear of anachronisms. He was able to write something that felt Egyptian or that felt Norse without someone coming along and saying, well, you put this weapon or this item in there 200 years before it would have happened, right? He can avoid those anachronisms very easily. He can sidestep them because this is a fictional world.
Yeah, it's fiction.
Yeah, but what it also does is it
Mm.
creates this framing that centers Europe, right? All of these places that I just described, along with many others, have this framing of this kind of fictional version of the Europe. You're going to find an ocean to the west that's the rough equivalent of the Atlantic. Um, and you're going to find these primitive peoples to the south. So if you look at Tolkien's Middle Earth, you're going to go down to the south and you're going to find these darker skinned people, the South Runs, who are going to kind of mesh up with real world darker skinned peoples. And they're going to be kind of more savage, less enlightened than the peoples who are in the central parts of Middle Earth, right?
So
That are based on European peoples.
I didn't want to spoil any of the points you were about to make, but I guess the question already, now that you're laying, I didn't know this, that these worlds were laid out that way. But you have me thinking, and you already mentioned, like in the Tolkien series, how the people of the South are considered lesser, or that less than, or whatever in that series. Is that a common theme throughout them? Like, I guess I did when I've not even watched all the Lord of the Rings movies or anything along those lines. It's not something I'm super into. But I always thought like this idea of eradicating whatever they're eradicating, trolls or whatever, or ogres. I can never remember.
Orcs, yeah.
Is that what it is? I mean, are those also those different subspecies or different species meant to be representative of others, right? Of other humans from these other parts of the world? Is this a rationale? Like,
so you Jared just opened one of the largest can of worms in the TTRPG area in the sphere of tabletop role playing games, the orc. So the orcs of Tolkien's orcs, right? There is ongoing debate. There's a huge kerfluffle. You can go on Twitter and you can find all kinds of stuff about it. Just within the last year, a huge kerfluffle thing, and within the sphere of these things, you can find this ongoing debate. So here's my take on it. Tolkien very much, and there's a lot of talk and debate about Tolkien's descriptions of orcs very early on, which uses a lot of language that kind of equates to what would have in Tolkien's time been called Mongoloid peoples. To describe the orcs, right? And the orcs are supposed to be kind of corruptions of that magically corrupted versions of the very noble and pure elven peoples. Now, of course, elves are light-skinned, they're very fair, they're described as good and noble and all of these other things.
Orlando Bloom, as I recall, right?
Absolutely, right? And orcs are dark-skinned, they are brutish, they are savage, they are animalistic, and all of these other things, right?
Yeah. I was about to ask Jared if he's even seen the movies.
I've not seen the movies, but again, just through pop culture osmosis, some of the stuff filters through. Yeah,
he's gotten it. So a lot of debate has gone back and forth about how much intent Tolkien had in crafting this particular paradigm of light, white equals good, dark equals savage, bad, all that side of thing.
Which isn't even novel. You have me already thinking, like, you were just bringing up Norse mythology, like Asgard and Midgard and all of this other stuff. And I actually just recently watched a Norwegian film about hunting trolls that was okay on Netflix or whatever. But like, even those narratives they used to weave back then, they would use this mythos, whether they believed it or not is debatable, to discuss, like, these are the bad ones. The trolls in this case are the bad ones. Or one of my favorites is, I think, the Ramayana of Southeast Asia, where they paint the people of Lanka, which is now Sri Lanka, as like these dark-skinned bad people. And again, it completely justifies what the country of India would later do to Sri Lanka, right? Like, so it's like,
so I do talk in my article about how we have this paradigm of colorism, right? That way predates what we know today as modern racism, right? It predates. You can go back to the Bible, you can go back to all sorts of ancient texts that set up this paradigm of dark is evil, filthy, dirty, sinful, whatever. Light is good, pure, so on and so forth, right? And that exists. And so I think there's a lot of debate about how much of this Tolkien intended. And I think the problem here is it's really less about the intent and more about the impact, right? And the impact is still there, whether or not Tolkien intended it that way. It's still there that this paradigm is established and has become very much a part of tabletop role-playing games, but other entertainment as well, right? And it still has existed throughout as a through thread, right? Um, and so while people are debating about back and forth about orcs and whether what they may or may not represent, um, I still think they set up this that kind of schism here, and so that's very much there. The other thing that's there that's recently come up with the most recent Lord of the Rings series that's also existent across all of these things because they're so intertwined, are these misconceptions. These misconceptions, for instance, that Europe was all white in the Middle Ages, right? And so, therefore, since these fantasy things, even though they're completely fictional, are based in medieval Europe, there is this line of thinking from a certain subset of people that fantasy should be all white because that's what we had throughout the majority of the 20th century, right? And anyone who tries to upset that apple cart is bringing some kind of woke nonsense into the debate, and they're not there. It's not, as many people try to say, historically accurate. Well, those people wouldn't know historical accuracy if it bit them on the ass because there were people of color in medieval Europe. They weren't there in great numbers, but they were certainly present. One of my other theses that I wrote in my master's program, I wrote on two 13th century medieval tales, Arthurian tales about Black African Arthurian knights. Um, and I constantly argue that if people in the 13th century could put Black people in their fiction, then so can we, right? But there's this pushback and this mistaken belief that because throughout the 20th century and throughout, even going back to the 18th century, frankly, a lot of historians tried to convince us that Europe was all white. A lot of entertainment tried to convince us that Europe was all white, and that people of color were not present at all in these narratives, and that women largely weren't present as well in many ways. And of course, as we go back and we reinvestigate and re-examine these things, we find that's false.
Well, yeah, I
Um,
mean that's we know for a fact. Like for some parts of what we call these Middle Ages, it's now not popular to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway because I don't care. Yeah, some of these were dark ages where Europe was definitely behind the rest of the world in a number of different fields, medicine and mathematics and philosophy and all those other types of things. And they would literally bring in scholars specifically from the kingdoms of like Mansa Musa and the various. I think at that time we're going with the Abbasid Khalif, right? The Abbas in the Middle East and things along those lines. They're bringing in these scholars to Europe to not educate, obviously, the general populace. They didn't want that, but yes, to have like these education of some of the scholars in Europe and some of the lords and dukes and earls and barons and whatever. All of
yes.
yes, all of it. So there was representation there, right? So we
Yeah,
know that
absolutely.
yeah.
And so, to go back to kind of one of the questions you had asked earlier, Jared, another thing that really kind of encouraged me to kind of delve more into this is that in the last 20 years, and particularly within the last 5 years, what we've seen in tabletop role playing games is an explosion of games that are more representative. And so here very recently, for instance, last year we had the introduction of a game called Coyote and Crow, which was written by a complete team of indigenous authors from North America, from all across North America. That is a tabletop role playing game that imagines a fictional North America where Europe was wiped out and Europeans never came to North America. We see games that are reimagining from uh, a kind of Turkish kind of Asia Minor perspective what the Silk Road looks like, and looking at it through that lens. We've seen games written for instance, there's a very popular role playing game called Call of Cthulhu that kind of focuses on the works of H.P. Lovecraft, who was notoriously racist. A very outspoken racist in the 1920s, but his works of what they call cosmic horror is still extraordinarily popular today. And So you may have heard of the television show and the book called Lovecraft Country. that recently came out. I see Nick knows, but Jared, of course, no shock there. But there's a role playing game supplement that where the author, who is African American, kind of takes that kind of genre, and a lot of the Cthulhu stuff is set in kind of the 1920s, and he reframes the 1920s and 30s, I should say. He reframes it and sets his kind of version of it in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance,
Mm.
and takes these ideas of cosmic horror. And really what Lovecraft is doing with his stories is he was a notorious xenophobe, and he hated the other, and he's using these kind of cosmologically horrific monsters and ideas that drive people insane as a kind of representation of the other, of the ravening hordes of the other that are going to kind of bring down traditional white culture, right? European culture. Um, and Chris Spivey, the writer of this thing called Harlem Unbound, kind of reframes it as um, the true monsters here are humans and racism. uh, and he kind of uses that to kind of reframe what's going on with Call of Cthulhu. And so there's a whole crop of writers out there, diverse writers, from the LBGT community, from all of these, that are rewriting these games and making games from a more representative perspective. And as that was happening, um, I kind of also, that was also kind of a motivation for me to kind of go back into the history of these games and discover, like, how did we get here, right? How did we get to this point? And why is there this kind of call and desire and push for these new kind of diverse representations? And the answer, of course, is very similar to what we're seeing around everywhere else. When I grew up in the 80s, the heroes were white men, right? When I went to the movies, when I watched television shows, overwhelmingly the heroes were white men. And if there were people of color, they were usually the sidekicks. They were usually the people who were kind of helping out, but they weren't in that lead position, right?
So, like
And I wanted to get rid of that.
Vine Deloria's cameo theory of history is also played out in pop culture, where people of color or people of different, well, and in fact, in the 80s and 90s, I don't even think we saw anybody of a different sexual orientation. So that's not a, but in pop culture, right, like they were not represented at all. But for people of color, they were only performing cameos. They were the
Yeah,
sidekick. I'm thinking specifically, I didn't even like G.I. Joe, but for some reason, the one G.I. Joe figure that stuck out to me was the First Nation guy. I don't know his name, but like he's the
yep.
one, and he was of just the stereotype was just like that's the one character that I recall as a kid, right? Like, you know,
Absolutely, yeah. If you saw a character, particularly indigenous character, or you saw a character of from Asia or whatever, they were going to conform to certain tropes, particularly in the 80s, right? Almost without a doubt, if you saw an Asian character, they were probably going to be carrying a katana, or they were going to be wearing some kind of like stylized version of kung fu or karate wear or something like that, right? These very kind of stereotypical portrayals, and that was just so typical. Yeah, and you're right. Very, very few. I mean, the only character I can immediately think of in a of a different sexual orientation is Billy Crystal's character on the sitcom Soap, who was the first openly gay character on television, and he was always, I mean, granted it was a comedy, but he was always going to be the one that they were going to be making fun of, right? To one degree or another, his like homosexuality was going to be like the focal point of all their jokes, right? That when he was on screen, uh, and this is all again representative. So the same things that were going on in pop culture are kind of what's going on in tabletop role playing games. So one of the things that I did when I was studying this was the publisher of Dungeons and Dragons and Dungeons and Dragons throughout all of this time has and remains the most popular of these games, published a magazine that coincided with Dungeons and Dragons, but also dealt with some of the other games that were out there to some extent. And this magazine, Dragon Magazine, runs popularly throughout the 70s and into the 80s. And so what I did was, one of the things I did was I looked at like the first 10 years of this magazine. And one of the questions I had was, if I go into this, how many characters of color am I going to see represented? The answer, of course, is extraordinarily few. The few that I did see, overwhelmingly, there were a handful, and those that I did see usually conformed to some very standard stereotypes. We see one black character, and he's standing there holding a spear, wearing a leopard skin, with a hide shield, right? Like huge shock, right? We see a few other characters of color and a few other things, but the majority of what I saw characters of color in there was a section in Dragon Magazine where, again, there was a Marvel universe, like a Marvel role-playing game based on the comics. Of course, this was long before the movies came along. It was still based on the comic books. And one of the popular things to do with tabletop role-playing games is to take popular characters from genre fiction, be it taking characters from, I'm going to take a character from a popular fantasy novel or something like that, and I'm going to translate them into D&D, right? Like, here's their stats in D&D. There was a Marvel role-playing game at the time, so they published stats for a lot of the Marvel characters at the time. And that was the majority of where you saw black characters, because in the late 60s and into the 70s, Marvel had kind of gotten on board with bringing in a lot of black characters into the Marvel universe. Power Man, Luke Cage, Power Man, and all of these others were brought into into the comics. And so while there's still issues of problematic representations there, that was the majority of colors of character that you saw in Dragon Magazine. Outside of those, the representations of characters of color are extraordinarily few. Again, because the majority of these games were being played and written by white men. When I was growing up, I would go to role-playing conventions. There are conventions where people get together and you can buy these games, people play these games and all of these things. And in the 70s and 80s in Los Angeles, when I grew up, and in the greater Los Angeles area, when I would go to these conventions, I could very easily go to one of these conventions that might draw 5,000 people or more. And I could count on one hand the number of attendees to these conventions that were black. Very easily in that time frame. In some contexts, that still hasn't changed, but we are starting to see a vast amount more of representation. And also, I should point out, there were very few women in those early days. The parity of women to men has greatly increased in these games since the 1990s. But we still don't quite see as much representation. Only recently has the representation really started to grow for people of color in these spheres. So yeah.
So I have a couple of questions that you've raised for me. The first one is, I'm going to go back to academics for just a second. Obviously, I'm the history whatever academic on this pod, and that's what I do. I am curious, because I've always wondered, at least in my experience in education for this last decade plus, what is this helping lead to this weird fascination people have specifically with medieval history? Like, I'm not denigrating medieval history by any stretch of the imagination. But it's never been my cup of tea for reasons that we're actually citing here. But do you think this somehow has this weird thing where people are like, I want to study knights and Lancelots and whatever, because like this is like, I've been inculcated in a society that fetishizes it in a way through these fantasies, right? Do you think that's leading to that? And for me, that's always been, I'll use the word, I hate this word, but I'm gonna use it anyway, cringe. But still, like, do you think it contributes to this? Because it's still a wildly popular form of history here, which just I don't know, just feels odd. It's just, and maybe for me because it's oversaturated, just not that interesting of a history. Again, we're learning about a part of the world during a time where not nearly as many cool things are happening as are happening in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia or North America. Like, why are we so into it?
I think there's a couple of things. One, yes, I think it's part of it. And it kind of works both ways, right? I think there's an interest in these games that leads people to medieval history, and there's an interest in medieval history that leads people to these games together. But I think also a huge part of it, and another thing I talked about in my thesis, is that, and of course you'll jive with this. This goes back to the ethically constitutive story. Um, Medieval Europe and perceptions and misconceptions of chivalry and bravery and knighthood are kind of endemic to these like Tolkien-esque style fantasy, but also to kind of Eurocentrism, right? A huge part of as you know, with the ethically constitutive story, is hearkening back to a past age when things were more glorious.
An imagined past, a romanticized past that never actually occurred, right? Like,
100%.
I mean, the
Yeah.
knight is one of my favorite things to pick on. They were horrific human beings. Like the chivalry,
Yeah.
they were bad people, literally bad people, the vast majority of them. I'm sure there were a
Yeah.
couple of good eggs like baked in there somewhere. But for the most part, right, you look at the primary sources of the era, they were sexual predators, they were drinkers, they were violent, they were not high
Yeah.
quality.
Well,
And most of the time, not even that well educated, right? The education wasn't even reserved for them because you want them as an educated person just going out and doing what you need them to do without asking questions, right? Like
Well, but I
yeah.
think that I think that's part of the point, right? And like maybe this is controversial, but I think the people that fetishize, medieval history, it's the very fact that the norms were such where there was this group of white men, overwhelmingly white, who could behave in this way, and they were free
Yeah.
to do so because they were the protectorate, right, in this case. And I think that's what part of the fantasy is and part of the obsession.
It is. It is. And I think well, and Jared will recognize this. One of our one of the medievalist former colleagues we used to work with, Dr. Karen Wagner, would call them thugs on horseback. And that's what they were, right? Like they were thugs on horseback. But I think you're right. I think there's an appeal for a certain subset of people to that kind of way of life, right? And for Americans specifically, we like to hearken back to the so-called Wild West, right? But there's a through thread from that back to kind of medieval Europe, right? And through kind of the European roots of America back to like you said, this romanticized image. So one of the other things I speak about when I'm looking at kind of the gender roles that are portrayed in these games. So very early on, when the game starts, when these games start out in like I said, 1974, very early on, a man by the name of a sociologist by the name of Gary Allen Fine, writes a book. He does the very first ethnography of tabletop role playing games. He in the late 1970s, he joins a couple of role-playing clubs and groups and kind of starts playing several of these games with them and kind of observing what he's seeing. And so one of the things that I tapped into, and trigger warning upcoming for sexual assault for those who need it. There's this phenomena that's going on very early on that he taps into, and he writes a book called Shared Fantasy. And he identifies a few things in this book. First off, he identifies role playing as what he calls a benign form of a folie à deux, or a shared delusion, but he calls it shared fantasy, where you're kind of sharing. Essentially, it's like a shared dream, right? What you're doing here, right? And he the other thing that one of the other things that he identifies here is identifies again with these groups of young men who are playing the games, and most of them, again, other identifiers that they have is that most of them are younger men in their teens into their 20s and maybe 30s, and a lot of them are middle class. And he identifies this just huge penchant, not just in Dungeons and Dragons, but in sci-fi games and other games, a penchant for sexual violence in these games against women. Women are overwhelmingly objectified in many ways, both in the art that is presented in association with these games, in the way they're framed. If you look at some of the articles, women are put in this the early articles, women are very put in this very paradigm where, for instance, women are either very beautiful or they're very ugly, right? And based on whether they're beautiful or ugly, they have certain abilities. Like, for instance, if they're very beautiful, they have access to the seduction spell, right? Where they can seduce men. There's some awful stuff in the very early days of the game. One of the games I point out, for instance, there's a game called Tunnels and Trolls, and very early on, one of the spells they have is called Enslave, where you can cast the spell on someone and literally enslave someone, right? And then it's also Dragon Magazine very early on produces an article, and I make the argument that, like, between what I was seeing in Fine's work and this article, that there was a larger problem. A larger problem, because Dragon Magazine produces an article where it is essentially calling out that there's not a place for this sexual violence in these games, right? That they shouldn't be there. And of course, I make the argument that, like, they wouldn't be writing this article if there wasn't a larger incidence of it, right? Going on. But even within that article, they make some claims about women in general that are problematic, right? And then we do have a few articles written in Dragon Magazine from the very small handful of women who were playing these games early on. A couple of them are writing some articles that are questioning the way women are framed. So, for instance, very early on in these games, female characters in Dungeons and Dragons couldn't have a strength score that was higher than a male. Like, their maximum strength score was capped lower than the maximum strength score of males of the equivalent type, be they a dwarf or an elf or a human or whatever. And so there are a lot of things going on the gender aspect here that are going on. And Fine, in his book, he quotes some very, like, graphic and brutal descriptions of sexual violence occurring in these games, right? And again, I think there comes a certain kind of romanticized version of medieval Europe that, to some extent, is not untrue, right? There was sexual violence in medieval Europe that was committed by these so-called noble knights and these chivalrous individuals, right? But there's kind of this penchant for wanting to make that kind of a part of the historically accurate experience, right alongside these things that are, like you said, that are completely false. These ideas of chivalry that didn't extend. I mean, they sound great on paper, but they weren't the reality of what was going on, right? And so all of those things kind of come together to kind of frame this world. And I think that goes back to the argument I was making before, kind of like what Nick says, is that what we have particularly very on in the early years, and there's still a subset of people within the hobby today who want that, right? That's the world they want, right? They want to harken back to European dominance. They want to harken back to white male dominance. They want to harken back to a world where they could say that they were the good guys, they were the knights, they were the ones who had chivalry, but in reality, they could run wild over the countryside and do what they wanted, right? And for some of them, that's what these games allow them to do.
Like spaghetti
Thankfully,
westerns in the mid 20th century for those people that were fantasizing, or more recently, there's been a pop culture phenomenon that I've noticed that I haven't researched, but people always try and talk to me about it like it's cool, and I refuse to read it. The reimagining World War II, where the Nazis win, and there's a tower there's a tower involved, something high
yeah,
tower.
man, yeah,
Whatever.
yeah,
What's it called?
the man
It's
in
a
the high,
broken
the man
in
in
a
the high
series.
castle, yeah,
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Like,
yeah,
what kind of weird fetish is that? Like, I don't like. Why are
yeah.
anyway? Yeah, it's
So we ask, and of course, I teach one of the courses that I teach is a course on alternate history, and of course, we try and steer students to other aspects of alternate history, and we've gotten some really cool ones, by the way. So I use as an example like that game Coyote and Crow, where we're
mm,
reimagining a North America without Europeans, right? As an alternate history, or I reimagined. I had a student do a reimagining of kind of the Aztec Empire kind of growing and dominating the world.
So that was my
Um,
next question, real quickly. I didn't want to cut that thought
yeah,
off, but now you have
yeah.
me thinking because I just remembered it. So representation in a European world could arguably still be problematic. Why have our fantasies, whether it's in tabletop gaming that then bleeds into film and television, and eventually we'll talk video games in just a second here. Why are those settings still? I get it that it's good to have representation in these European settings, but when is the setting, or why is the setting not, again, I don't know, within like the Zulu nation of the 19th
Hmm,
century or
hmm.
something along those lines? Or I mean, it is increasingly because of I would argue like anime and manga culture. It is increasingly becoming there's better Asian representation now, but like why is it not really anywhere else? Like
Yeah.
why don't we have those settings? Because again, and I'm speaking specifically to what I know about middle age to modern Africa, there are some amazing settings for to introduce African mythos and African ways of like, but we're just never going to get there. Is that
Yeah. So we are getting those, absolutely. And there are some spectacular examples out there currently, or that are on the horizon, that are in the works right now. There's some great Afrocentric games that are out there. Like you mentioned, that maybe I have a little bit of passion. All of these books behind me are all tabletop role playing games. So like this one right here, Orun, is an Afrocentric
mm,
sci-fi role playing game.
okay,
Um, there are those examples that we're just now starting to get, like I said, within the last few years.
okay.
But I think the staying power of Europe kind of goes back to what Nick says. There are those people that cling to that, right? They cling to that as the truth, right? As the truth of our past, as the truth of our history. And so it bleeds into our fantasy. And there are those who, when games come out like Orun or Coyote and Crow or all of these other games that point to different ways to tell stories, there's a pushback from a pretty vocal group, just like we see in other, like in video
Little
games, we see,
Mermaids and Little Mermaid
yeah,
controversies and whatnot. Yeah.
yeah. There's a pushback that that is trying to maintain this kind of popular Eurocentric
Monopoly.
ideal as a monopoly and as the norm, right? And these are the these are the others that are trying to come in and take that away from everybody, and destroy that, right?
Well, and
Whereas
like, I
I
mean,
think,
let's call it what it
yeah,
is, right? Like, first off, this clinging to this fantasized version of the history, right, is crucial to their identity. And it's just manifesting itself in their interest, in this case, in both
mhm,
medieval history and in these like fantasy games. So then, even a game that is purely fantasy, that's fiction, that is based on some other part of the world or some other culture, just its very existence is a threat to their identity, their real world identity in modern times, right?
right. Right. Well, and I constantly, continually make the argument that it's never just fiction, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
never just fantasy, because we're drawing these things, be it European fiction, be it Afrocentric, be it Asian, whatever. We are drawing these worlds and things from what we know, right? So we are putting a dabbling of the cultures that we know and understand, right, into these things, right? So it's just laced through with these things that are either coming from Europe or they're coming from Africa, they're coming from Asia, whatever the case may be. And so it's not just fantasy, right? And then there's all sorts of like semiotic coding that's put into them, and allegory and metaphor that is coming from the real world, right? So a lot of people try and just make this claim that it doesn't matter that there's only white characters here because it's a fictional world, so there's not really any African Americans in this world anyway, right? And they try and use that as an excuse to negate representation, right?
Well, I mean, it's
Gatekeeping.
obviously like cherry picking, right? They
Yes.
support historical accuracy only when it serves their needs, right?
Yeah, 100%, right? And if it's any kind of accuracy that goes against their particular narrative, then they're like, oh, well, that's different, right? And extraordinarily so. So a huge part of what it is that we're dealing with here is we're dealing with this kind of internalized envisionment of what a hero is, what fantasy is, what storytelling is, right? What the hero's journey is, and all of these other things, right? That it's those conceived notions that this new crop of not just tabletop role-playing games, but video games and across the board is trying to push against, right? And some are even trying to shift. So there's a game called out there, a tabletop role-playing game out there called Steal Away Jordan. And it is a game where the author, she's pretty cool people. She's a black author, and she wrote this game specifically to frame and create a role-playing game where you play a slave in the American South, and she did it to give the concept of slaves, to give them agency, right? To show that even though these people were enslaved, even though they were owned and they had this, that they were still human beings, that they still had a certain level of agency, that they still lived their lives, and that they created music and art and did all of these other things despite their horrific condition, right? Because all too often we try and view in our entertainment, we try and view people of color, all marginalized groups, through their trauma and through their pain, right? And that's all we see of them, right? And so she created this role-playing game as kind of an educational experience, right? And so we're starting to see that sort of thing happening in these spaces as well, where games are being used for educational purposes, for people, for instances like that, for people with various types of neurodivergence and all of these other things. These games are starting to be used as tools to help guide people, that there are different ways of doing things, that there are different ways of telling stories, and that it all doesn't have to be focused on what we've had for so long. And thankfully, that trend is continuing. Within this year, we're going to see a number of more games that are going to come from a very diverse crop of authors, and there are already plenty out there from very diverse crops of things that are changing kind of the landscape. And I hope that keeps on and continues.
So that's I mean, that's good news. That's good news that because here's the thing, this is no longer, I mean, you said at the beginning of the episode that this was kind of niche, but I don't think it's as niche anymore as it was. I mean,
No.
my kids play these games, and I mean, I definitely see it's much more popular now. It's not made fun of as much in pop culture, like references and things along. I remember just watching Key and Peele last night. They had a skit on one, but like it's definitely one of those things. But here's I guess where I want to go with this. Even bigger, obviously we have to talk about this, are video games. It is the number one form of entertainment, I think, in the world now. I think at this point, gaming produces more dollars and cents than film and music and all those other things combined at this point, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of, I mean, it feels like we're going back in the conversation, so I don't necessarily want to go backwards in the conversation, but are we seeing the same kind of trajectory from tabletop games to video games moving forward, as well as now this more recent, I guess, striving to change that or flip that narrative a little bit? Have we
Mhm.
seen that kind of model? Because here's the thing: I remember way back when I was a kid, which was a really long time ago. One of the first video games I ever played was literally Dungeons and Dragons. It was on some 4-bit or
Yeah,
2-bit.
yeah.
It certainly wasn't even 8-bit, I didn't think, but some sort of console. Maybe I think it was an Intellivision or something
In
along those lines.
television, probably, yeah.
Is that what it
Yep.
was? Anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
And the first game I ever played was Dungeons and Dragons. It was literally Dungeons
Yeah.
and Dragons. I'm not a '90s parent sitting here saying that video games make people violent or something along those lines, but I do think they are a representation, just like we talked about, of storytelling and hero
Mhm.
crafting and things along those lines. I do
Yeah.
think there is a reflexive relationship there. Are we seeing the same thing? Did we see the same thing in early gaming, and are we seeing the pushback now, or resistance, or agency?
Yeah. So I will say, before I address that it's important to note here that a lot of video gaming today, huge segments, Legend of Zelda, World of Warcraft, they all owe
They're in
their
that genre, which is why
they
I'm
owe
asking.
they owe their existence to Dungeons and Dragons, to tabletop role playing games, right?
Yeah.
Computer role playing games all flow from tabletop role playing games, right? And they're a huge part of the gaming segment, right? These wildly popular titles that are out there. But I will say that
The MMORPG, whatever. Like, yeah,
MMORPG, yep,
yeah,
yep,
yeah.
absolutely. And so, yes and no is my answer. So we certainly see, just like we see in other parts of entertainment, throughout the history of role-playing games. Of course, the very early role-playing games you go back to, in television, right? And some of these very early characters, the very early characters were these little dots and pixels, and you really couldn't tell
Right.
what they were, or any kind of like gender, or anything like that in the very early games. Gradually that started to change a little bit, but overwhelmingly, once again, white men dominate, the genre, right? Throughout role-playing games as the heroes, right? These are the heroes throughout so many of our video games. um we are starting to see some change, in gaming, where, yes, we are starting to see a wider range of characters from marginalized groups across the board, over the last, several years, and being moved out of being kind of the sidekick characters to being central characters, in these games and stuff like that. And then, of course, in a lot of these games, so in a lot of the MMORPGs, in a lot of the, role playing games, uh, you are allowed to choose what your hero looks like, right? But you will find, I think, that if you go into these games, um, that exist where you are able to choose that, you're overwhelmingly going to find, characters who are not people of color. Overwhelmingly, you are going to find, I think, also that there are, a lot of games that, present, very few options for you to choose, people of color. And then, of course, the other paradigm, along gender is that, we end up with a problem that was a problem that exists in tabletop role playing games early on and throughout its history. If you look at the art, and in games, we have the problem of the chainmail bikini, right? If you have two characters of the exact same class, and one is female and one is male, with few exceptions, the female, character is going to be clad in this form-fitting, very skimpy armor, and the male character is going to be in this very kind of bulky kind of armor, right? We want to accentuate the body of the female, right? And give her either the chainmail bikini, or as close as the chainmail bikini as we can come, and the male character is going to have full armor, right? Um, and so we see, these problems, and the gaming industry has a notorious problem, and so there's a double issue here in the gaming industry. We have kind of the entertainment industry, which has notorious problems, right, with both representation of women and people of color. But then we also have the tech industry, which also has the same problem. And video games are a marrying of these two, right? And so there are still a lot of problematic issues in games, even as we're beginning to see some representation start to increase. There's just that, and then of course there is this very, again, just like all of these others, this very vocal group of people who want to feel that their ability to be the dominant force in charge of these things is being taken from them, right? It's slipping away from them, right? And I think more so with tabletop role-playing games and video games, it's even more internalized, again, because there's that interactive part. So when, like Nick talked about earlier, that people are internalizing these things, I think they internalize them even more with these games because they're interactive, even more so than reading a book or watching a movie. So they really feel like a part of their identity is because they're playing these characters, right? They're internalizing these characters who are going out and being the standard white male hero and doing the things that that hero does and conforming to these kind of Eurocentric and Orientalist norms and stuff like that. I think they feel that more keenly with these characters because of the interactive uh, um, aspect of both tabletop and video games.
Yeah, and you had me thinking on the fly, reflecting back on what Nick was saying on an earlier point regarding like sexual predation and things along those lines, this fetishization, this almost fantasy, like this is a way for. But now I'm thinking back to the countless, like I mean, it's world famous at this point. Everyone knows you jump into an Xbox Live lobby in Call of Duty, you're going to hear every type of racial slur over and over and over again, and it's almost a
Right.
knee jerk reaction for these individuals when they're upset or demeaning somebody to use racial slurs specifically.
Yes.
Not they're intentionally choosing those words, or maybe
Absolutely.
unintentionally or whatever. That might be part of like that fantasy as well, like this ability
Mhm.
to quote unquote anonymously be able to be this person online, where they could never get away with this walking through the grocery store or the
Right.
mall or whatever. So I
Yeah, that
mean,
anonymity is key, and
yeah,
and they love the shock value of it, right? That's a huge part of what they're doing. The shock value of just
right.
blurting out these racial slurs, right? Part of this is that, and that's one of the, I think, the key differences between at least the tabletop space and the video game space. One of the key differences is that the tabletop space, or I should say the video game space, comes with a certain level of anonymity, and because of the nature of tabletop role playing games, that's a lot less likely with tabletop
Yeah,
role playing games because you're directly interacting with people, even if you're
right.
doing it, as has become even more popular in the COVID world, even if you're doing it through some sort of video chat
Discord or yeah,
or
whatever.
something like that. There's less chance of a level of anonymity. That being said, there are some who just absolutely refuse to give it up. We had there was a big blow up in the space just this last year. So TSR was the company that created Dungeons and Dragons. Gary Gygax was one of the founders of Dungeons and Dragons. Um, he has some children, and one of his children in particular uh, uh, became involved with kind of a new iteration of TSR to try and revive like the glory days of TSR, to harken back. Um, and he's been associated to one degree or another with some other people who are trying to bring back some of the older titles that TSR um, uh, um, wrote. One of those being Star Frontiers, and a leak came out. They were going to put together kind of a crowdfunding campaign to bring out a new version of Star Frontiers, and a leak came out of some of the material that was going to be in this book, and absolutely horrific. Trying to conform to these scientific um, styles that they put in here, they're going back to using terms like Negroid and Mongoloid. They're establishing these ideas that those who are of kind of Nordic extraction have better statistics, strength, intelligence, those sort of things, than those who come from these other strains of humanity, and just some horrific, awful stuff. Um, and so there are those people who are still out there who are still trying to cling to these just, again, outdated ideas, because, again, um, those are the worlds they want to play in. Those are the worlds they were going to see. And this is a place where they can have that world where white people are still in charge, and where everybody else has to bow to them, and they can do as they please within the context of these games. Like I said, thankfully, there are plenty out there who are challenging those ideas, and trying to upset those apple carts, and write a more diverse and representative form of game and types of game that are pushing back against that. But I think these individuals in all of these types of entertainment are they're kind of the ones that we're having to push back against, because they don't want to give it up.
Last question, at least
Yeah.
for me. Nick might have one, but last question for me. So obviously, recent events of the last, let's say, decade here, specific now will be specific to the U.S. We were pretty specific to it already, but maybe just Western culture in general. But specific to the U.S., you've seen obviously a rise in, let me just be blunt, white male straight cis nationalism, like
Yeah.
evangelical nationalism, as a reaction to politically or socially, or even in pop culture, as a reaction to them feel like they're losing something. So now they're just being more upfront about their blatant racist or elitist or whatever, like the way they think about the world. Have we seen that same reaction in the gaming world in this case? Have we seen these? I don't know. Now I sound like Dave Chappelle. The whites. Have we seen the whites react this way? The way I
Yes.
perceive them react, like, okay, like, you're not taking this from us, and we're going to be now even more overt in our wildly historically inaccurate, unethical, just problematic way of thinking. Have we seen that?
So yes, we
You
have.
brought up some games that are being made by people or women of color. Is there blowback now from?
Absolutely. So last year, also, a Kickstarter campaign was put up for a game called Into the Motherlands. Into the Motherlands is written by a diverse team of authors. It was kind of conceived by B. Dave Walters, who is one of the big African American creators in the space, and he writes this as kind of a science fiction reimagining. He goes back to, you mentioned before, Mansa Musa. He goes
Yeah.
back to this concept that the kingdom that Mansa Musa was part of, Mali, at one point sent out. There's a tale that they sent out a fleet of ships into the Atlantic in the direction of the New World, but that fleet just disappeared. That in this kind of reimagining, that fleet encounters some kind of a weird storm that transports them to another world, and they kind of reestablish a new society in kind of based on African themes and African norms. But of course, now that they're in this new world, they don't have to deal with the coming of Europeans. They don't have to deal with the slave trade and all of these other things. So they end up building this kind of sci-fi world that kind of develops this Afrocentric thing, and there's pushback, right? There's pushback. So you have a group of individuals in the world who are what's going on right now is what's called the OSR movement, or the old school Renaissance, who are pushing for going back to the early days of Dungeons and Dragons, the way it was before, right?
Make D&D
And
great again.
absolutely right. And so now there are some people among that who they're perfectly fine. They just want to go back because some of the earlier versions of D&D had a kind of a different rule set, and they kind of want to go back to that rule set, but they're not necessarily about like the more but there are those who also want to go back to that that time frame when they could rape and pillage and burn and freely do whatever within these games and do all these other things. So you have pushback there, and you have pushback from those who again are screaming about accurate historical accuracy as they envision it, and all of these other things, and about why do we need these changes? These games were fine as they were. No, they're not racist, and no, they're not Eurocentric, and no, they're not this, and no, they're not that. Right? The same kind of pushback we see across the gamut. Those who are just kind of denying or not seeing what's going on, who want things to either remain as they are or go back to the way they were, right? Make America great again, if you will. Which I will point out in an odd connection. If you haven't read, anyone here has not read Octavia Butler's Earthseed books, great sci-fi books written in the 1990s, where she imagines a very white Christian nationalist president in the early 21st century who runs under the campaign slogan "Make America Great Again." Very interesting read if you remember what's been going on in the last few years. But yeah, there definitely is that pushback from those who, again, they think they're losing something. They feel like, and you know, their dominance is slipping, right? And they want to re-envision and to some extent, like I said, these games allow them to do that. These games allow them to crawl back into a world where they can be in control and they can set the pace and the tone and the placement and the hierarchies and all of those sorts of things.
Do you have anything, Nick?
No, I think I'm good. It's all fascinating stuff. I think that we could probably talk about this and video gaming and etc. The three of us for hours.
We easily could.
Maybe we'll continue to do so in future episodes for sure, because me and Jared we talk about gaming all the time. And in fact, we did an episode on DayZ and stuff like that. But I just want to say thank you to Stefan for joining us again. And thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. If you like this episode and you're interested in supporting us on Patreon, you can do so at revolutionandideology.com. Patreon.com/revolutionandideology. I am Nick.
I'm Jared.
Thank you.
Later.